I spent my whole life making somebody rich. I busted my for that son of a gun, and he left me to die like a dog in a ditch, and told me I'm all used up. He used up my labor, he used up my time, plundered my body and squandered my mind, and he left me a pension of handouts and wine, and told me I'm all used up. My kids are in hock to a god you call work, slaving their lives out for some other jerk. Yeah, my youngest in Frisco just made shipping clerk, and he don't know I am all used up. Young people reaching for power and gold don't have respect for anything old. For pennies they're bought and for promises sold. Someday they'll be all used up. We use up the oil and we use up the trees, use up the air, we use up the seas. Well, how's about you, friends, and how's about me? What's left when we're all used up? Outside my window the world passes by, gives me a handout and spits in my eye, and no one can tell me 'cause no one knows why. I'm living but I'm all used up. Sometimes in my dreams I sit by a tree. My life is a book of how things used to be, and the kids gather round and they listen to me, and they don't think I'm all used up. And there's songs and there's laughter and things I can do, and all that I've learned I can give back to you, and I'd give my last breath just to make it come true. No, I'm not all used up. We use up the oil and we use up the trees, use up the air, we use up the seas. Well, how's about you, friends, and how's about me? What's left when we're all used up? Before the advent of labor unions and collective bargaining, we didn't really have a middle class in the United States. The disappearance of the middle class in the United States can be traced to the disappearance of labor unions in America. The labor movement was a singing movement, and it left a lot of wonderful songs. And this concert of folk songs of the American labor movement is part of the Martin County Library System's 2021 Chautauqua South season. Chautauqua South is sponsored by the Friends of the Martin County Library. As you travel across America in the 21st century, you can still see many of the old abandoned mills still standing, giant brick smokestacks going hundreds of feet up into the air. Cy Kahn, who's from South Carolina, I believe, he wrote this song about the Ragon Mill in western Georgia over at the Alabama border. It opened in 1898 and closed in 1970, and he wrote this song called Ragon Mill. At the east end of town, at the foot of the hill, there's a chimney so tall that says Ragon Mill. But there's no smoke at all coming out of the stack, 'cause the mill has shut down and it ain't a-comin' back. And the only tune I hear is the sound of the wind as it blows through the town. Weave and spin, weave and spin. Well, I'm too old to work, and I'm too young to die, and there's nowhere to go for my woman and I. And the only tune I hear is the sound of the wind as it blows through the town. Weave and spin, weave and spin. There's no children at all in the narrow, empty streets. Since the mill has shut down, it's so quiet I can't sleep. And the only tune I hear is the sound of the wind as it blows through the town. Weave and spin, weave and spin. Yes, the mill has shut down. It's the only life I know. Tell me, where will I go? Tell me, where will I go? And the only tune I hear is the sound of the wind as it blows through the town. Weave and spin, weave and spin. Well, new technologies often result in putting people out of a job, and some professions completely disappear. You know, if a living wage breaks the system probably ought to be broken. This is a song from the 1870s after the appearance of the railroad, and I want you to stop and think about all the jobs that disappeared when the railroad arrived. Think of the people who used to drive those wagons, the teamsters. Before everything was moved by rail, it was moved by wagon. And there were wheelwrights who made the wheels for those wagons, men who built the wagons. There were people who took care of the oxen and horses who pulled the wagons. There were people who put shoes on those animals who pulled those wagons. And then there were the people who unloaded them when they arrived. And a lot of those people's jobs disappeared when the railroad came along. And we have a song about that. This is one from Pennsylvania. It's out of a book by George Corson, published in 1949, called Pennsylvania Songs and Legends. And it's called The Wagoners Curse on the Railroad, and it's very likely a true story. It certainly tells us how the people who drove the wagons felt when the railroad appeared. And it's to an old traditional tune from Ireland that's either called The Wearing of the Green or The Rising of the Moon, depending on what decade you learned it. And this one is on my CD, Buttercup Joe, which is available from my website, folksinging.org. Oh, come all you jolly wagoners and stand up man by man, that's opposed to the railroad or to any such a plan. Well, once I made good money by driving my team, but now the goods are carried on the railroad by steam. Let the devil take the fellow who invented such a plan. It's the ruin of every wagoner and every honest man. It ruins wheelwrights and blacksmiths and finishes our trade. So the hell with all the railroads that ever yet was made. When we go to Philadelphia inquiring for a load, they tell us quite directly it's gone out on the railroad. And the rich folks, they all tell us that this plan they much admire, but it ruins us poor wagoners and makes our taxes higher. So come all you jolly wagoners who have attained good wives, go back home to your farms, for it's there you'll spend your lives. When your corn is all cribbed up and your fine grain it is sowed, you'll have nothing left to do but sit and curse the damn railroad. Probably a true story. On February 1st of 1937, a wave of sit-down strikes against General Motors was broadened at Chevrolet Plant No. 4, which was seized on that day. The United Auto Workers strategy involved a diversionary strike at nearby Plant No. 9 to draw company personnel away from Plant No. 4, which was the true target. As the battle between Unionists and company guards took place inside Plant No. 9, other strikers captured the key plant, Plant No. 4. Since all Chevrolet engines were produced in Plant No. 4, eliminating this supply would shut Chevrolet operations down nationwide. And 10 short days later, on February 11th of 1937, the strike ended as General Motors recognized the United Auto Workers as bargaining agents for its members. This may seem a simple story in the history of American unions, but it actually represents one of the most significant events in labor history. And the attorney for the United Auto Workers was a man named Maurice Sugar, a Jewish fellow from Michigan who was a conscientious objector during the First World War and spent a year in prison. And during the sit-down strike in 1937, he wrote a song about what it's like to be on strike and out of work and hungry and broke, waiting in a soup kitchen line for a bowl of soup. And he wrote a song called the Soup Song, recycling a traditional melody called My Bonnie Lies Over the Ocean. I'm spending the night in a flop house. I'm spending my days on the street. I'm looking for work, but I find none. I wish I had something to eat. Soup, soup, they gave me a bowl of soup. Soup, soup, they gave me a bowl of soup. So I went off to fight for my country. I went off to bleed and to die. I came home and I asked them to help me, and this was my country's reply. Soup, soup, they gave me a bowl of soup. Soup, soup, they gave me a bowl of soup. So I saved $20 with my banker to buy me a car and a yacht. I went down to withdraw all my money, and this was the answer I got. Soup, soup, they gave me a bowl of soup. Soup, soup, they gave me a bowl of soup. When I die and I go up to heaven, St. Peter will let me ride in. He can tell by the soup that they fed me that I was unable to sin. Soup, soup, they gave me a bowl of soup. Soup, soup, they gave me a bowl of soup. This next song is on my Orphan Train CD, available from my website, folksinging.org. Ann Hills wrote this one about the silk mills up in Allentown, Pennsylvania. You know, in the days of the American colonies, American colonists in New England had great pride in having stills and making their own liquor, so they wouldn't have to support the distilleries in England who made the gin and the whiskey. And they also were opposed to paying the exorbitant taxes on silk imported from China. And so they started keeping silkworms in the closet and making their own silk in the days of the colonies. And by the 1880s, they had giant silk mills in the Lehigh Valley of Pennsylvania. By 1928, there were more than 140 silk mills in that Lehigh Valley. And you still see the silk mill buildings standing today as you drive through that part of the world. So this is the one that Ann Hills wrote about the women who worked in those silk mills in Allentown. It's called Silken Dreams. This here loom is 50 years old. Me and Mary were a little older. We came here in 1918. Now the factory's closing down. This loom came from another mill that was falling into a river. Me and Mary, we came here from Austria together. On a hot summer night, you could hear these looms. They never shut them down. Weaving and spinning the silken dreams of the workers in Allentown. Back in the days when I moved here to try my hands as a weaver, We made silk that could circle the world more than 30 times around. We made silk for the Navy flags of the finest Bamberg threads. We made silk that could beat the best. That's what we always said. And on a hot summer night, you could hear these looms. They never shut them down. Weaving and spinning the silken dreams of the workers in Allentown. Now me and Mary and all these looms were the last ones at the factory. Sick, expired, or just plain tired, all those weavers come and gone. Young folks today, they don't see the sense in a skill whose time has run. Stop the clock and close the shop, this silk mill's day is done. Hot summer night, you could hear these looms, they never shut them down. Weaving and spinning the silken dreams of the workers in Allentown. Hot summer night, you could hear these looms, they never shut them down. Weaving and spinning the silken dreams of the workers in Allentown. This one is off of my CD, The Radio's Taking Our Songs Away, the irrepressible American folk song in the age of the selfie. This one was written by Malvina Reynolds, who lived on Parker Street in Berkeley in California. Bury me in my overalls. Bury me in my overalls, don't use my gabardines. Bury me in my overalls or in my worn-out jeans. Give my suit to Uncle Jake, he can wear it at my wake, and bury me in my overalls. The undertaker will get my dough, the grave will get my bones, and what is left will have to go for one of those granite stones. But this suit cost me 2 weeks' pay, let it live another day and bury me in my overalls. The grave, it is a quiet place, there is no labor there, and I'll rest so much easier in the clothes I always wear. This suit was made for warmer climes, holidays and happy times, so bury me in my overalls. I gave a hand to clear the land and make the cities rise. I helped to bring the harvest in and lay the railroad ties. I boomed around from east to west. It's time I had a little rest, so bury me in my overalls. And when I get to heaven, where they tally work and sin, they'll open up those pearly gates and holler, come on in. A working stiff like you we know has had his share of hell below, so come to glory in your overalls. Yes, a working stiff like you we know has had his share of hell below, so come to glory in your overalls. The late Dorothy Parker wrote, "If you want to know what God thinks of money, look at the people he gave it to." Here's a poem that George Milburn collected in his wonderful book, The Hobo's Hornbook, published in 1930, more than 400 pages of hobo poetry and lore and stories and songs. He collected them before the stock market crashed in 1929, so these are from the real career hobos and not your ancestors and mine who went out and rode trains during the Depression looking for work. The author of this poem is anonymous. It's called The Two Bums. It talks about the bum on the rods, that's the hobo who rides the freight trains, and it talks about the bum on the plush. That's the millionaire who has a whole staff of people to prepare him his meals. And the poem goes like this. The bum on the rods is hunted down as the enemy of mankind, while the other is driven around to his club and is feted, wined, and dined. And those who curse the bum on the rods as the essence of all that is bad will greet the other with a winning smile and extend a hand so glad. The bum on the rods is a social flea who gets an occasional bite. The bum on the plush is a social leech, blood-sucking day and night. The bum on the rods is a load so light that his weight we scarcely feel, but it takes the labor of dozens of men to furnish the other a meal. Now, as long as you sanction the bum on the plush, the other will always be there, but rid yourself of the bum on the plush, and the other will disappear. Then make an intelligent, organized kick. Get rid of the weights that crush. Don't worry about the bum on the rods. Get rid of the bum on the plush. 125 years ago in the United States, many of the workers were immigrants, and they didn't speak English and they didn't read English, and songs were an easier way to communicate ideas about organized labor than books or pamphlets which these workers could not read. And so people would take a lot of the church hymns, which many of these immigrants were familiar with because a lot of them were religiously observant, and they would change the words around and make them about collective bargaining and organizing in a union. And this is what John Brill did with the 19th century hymn, What a Friend We Have in Jesus. He wrote these words in 1916. Are you cold, forlorn, and hungry? Are there lots of things you lack? Is your life made up of misery? Then dump the bosses off your back. Are you almost split asunder, loaded like a long-eared jack? Boob, why don't you buck like thunder and dump the bosses off your back? All the agonies you suffered, you could end with one good whack. Stiffen up, you ornery duffers, and dump the bosses off your back. I want to talk about Joe Hill, the man who never died. A lot of people have heard of him, but very few people know the true story of his life. Joel Emanuel Haglund was born in Sweden in 1879. He was the third of 9 children, 3 of whom died young. His father, Olaf, worked for the railroad, the Gävle-Dala Railroad there in Sweden, and his father was killed when Joe was only 8 years old in what they used to call an industrial accident in those days before worker safety laws. And now his mother was left to support 6 children. And the father, of course, was the sole support of the family. So she was in real trouble, and they were broke and they were hungry. And Joe Hill never forgot how charitable organizations like the Salvation Army wouldn't give his mother a dime, and he never forgave them, and he never forgot them. In his teens, he contracted tuberculosis, and he went to a hospital in Stockholm for several years where he was treated for that disease. During that time, his mother died, and now he was an orphan. So he sold his parents' house, and with the proceeds of that sale, he used some of the money to buy a ticket for him and his brother Paul to go to the United States. We don't know exactly when he landed here, but they came through Ellis Island in New York, and Joe Hill proceeded to look for work, bumming his way out to Ohio. We know he was in San Francisco for the 1906 earthquake because he wrote a letter to a friend in Sweden at that time. And finally, in 1907, Joe Hill found employment on the streets of Spokane, Washington, working for the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, one big union for both skilled and unskilled workers, and he was organizing workers in this union on the street. Well, in those days, the IWW published a little book just big enough to fit in your pocket, called the Little Red Songbook, and it was full of Union songs. And it was kept in your pocket, so even if you were arrested and went to jail, you could pull the songbook out in your cell and sing it with your cellmates. Those Little Red Songbooks would go into people's pockets, and a week later, a stevedore would be singing those songs in Stockholm, or on the docks in Tokyo, or Sydney, Australia, or London. These songs went all over the world because the Little Red Songbook could go in your pocket. So here's what they would do on the streets of Spokane, Washington. A lot of these union organizers had scars and bruises from getting beat up by the thugs that were hired by the factories and mines and mills that they were trying to organize the workers therein. So whoever had the fewest bruises would go down to the secondhand store and buy clothing that was fit for a banker. A bowler hat, a vest, a watch chain. Of course, they couldn't afford the watch, and striped pants. And he would put on this attire and stand on a street corner in Spokane, Washington, and he would shout, "I've been robbed! I've been robbed!" When he had a great big crowd of people gather around him, he would say, "I've been robbed by the capitalist system, fellow workers." And then Joe Hill and his cronies would jump out from a corner of a building, and they would be singing a song. Now, you got to remember, the Salvation Army would play on the streets of Spokane, Washington, and they promised salvation in heaven. But what these workers wanted is they didn't want to get a meal when they got to heaven. They were hungry today, and they wanted that meal right now. They wanted salvation right here on earth, not later when they got to heaven. So Joe Hill thought it was kind of like pie in the sky, that idea. He coined that term, and of course he thought that was a lie. Pie in the sky, getting satisfaction after you lived on earth and went to heaven. So he wrote this song and was published in the Little Red Songbook back in 1911, and went like this. To the tune of the Sweet By and By, a popular hymn. Long-haired preachers come out every night, trying to tell you what's wrong and what's right. But when asked about something to eat, they will answer in voices so sweet. You will eat by and by in that glorious land in the sky, way up high, work and pray, live on hay. You'll get pie in the sky when you die. That's a lie. He called it the Starvation Army, the old Salvation Army. And the Starvation Army, they play, and they roll and they thump and they pray. When they've got all your coins on the drum, they will tell you when you're on the bum that you will eat by and by in that glorious land in the sky, way up high, work and pray, live on hay. You'll get pie in the sky when you die. That's a lie. Holy rollers and jumpers come out, and they roll and they jump and they shout. Give your money to Jesus, they say, and you'll eat on that glorious day. But you will eat by and by in that glorious land in the sky, way up high, work and pray, live on hay. You'll get pie in the sky when you die. That's a lie. If you work hard for country and wife, trying to get something good in this life, you're a sinner and a bad man, they tell. When you die, you will sure go to hell. But you will eat by and by in that glorious land in the sky, way up high, work and pray, live on hay. You'll get pie in the sky when you die. That's a lie. Working folks of all countries unite, hand in hand we for freedom will fight. When this world and its wealth we have gained, to the grafters we'll sing this refrain, that you will eat by and by when you learn how to cook and how to fry. Chop some wood, it'll do you good, and you'll eat in that sweet by and by. That's no lie. Joe Hill. Well, the concept of wage slavery is a pretty simple one. Wage slavery means that people will work for whatever wage the most desperate person will work for. Whoever is the poorest, most recently arrived immigrant in the most desperate situation, out of desperation will work for the lowest wage, and that brings everybody else's wage down, unless you're in a union. If you're in a union, then the union can collectively bargain for you and make sure that you're getting a living wage for all people, even the most desperate workers. So here's one that was published in the Little Red Songbook in 1913, and Joe Hill wrote this to a parody of another popular hymn published in 1899, Louis E. Jones's Power in the Blood, and of course, Joe Hill called this one Power in the Union. Would you have freedom from wage slavery? Then join in the grand industrial band. If you from hunger and misery would be free, come on in the band and lend a hand. There is power in a band of working folks when we stand hand in hand. There's power, that's the power that must rule in every land. One industrial union grand. Would you have mansions of gold in the sky and live in a shack way out in the back? Would you have wings up to heaven to fly and starve here with rags on your back? There is power in a band of working folks when we stand hand in hand. That's the power that must rule in every land. One industrial union grand. If you've had enough of the blood of the lamb, then join in the grand industrial band. If for a change you'd prefer eggs and ham, come on in the band and lend a hand. There is power in a band of working folks when we stand hand in hand. That's the power that must rule in every land. One industrial union grand. Come all ye workers from every land and join in the grand industrial band. Then we our share of this earth will demand. Come on in the band and lend a hand. There is power in a band of working folks when we stand hand in hand. That's the power that must rule in every land. One industrial union grand. One industrial union grand. In 1912, Joe Hill went up to Canada, to British Columbia, to assist on a railroad workers' strike, and he took a popular pseudo-Irish song called Where the Shannon River Flows, and he rewrote the words, and he made it a union song called Where the Fraser River Flows. Fellow workers, pay attention to what I'm gonna mention, for it is the fixed intention of the workers of the world that we should all be ready, true-hearted, brave, and steady, to rally round the standard when the red flag is unfurled. Where the Fraser River flows, each fellow worker knows they have bullied and oppressed us, but still our union grows. And we're gonna find a way, boys, shorter hours and higher pay, boys. We're gonna win the day, boys, where the Fraser River flows. Now these gunny sack contractors have all been dirty actors. They are not our benefactors, each fellow worker knows. But we've got to stick together in foul or sunny weather, and we'll show no white feather where the Fraser River flows. Where the Fraser River flows, each fellow worker knows. They have bullied and oppressed us, but still our union grows. And they're gonna find a way, boys, shorter hours and higher pay, boys. We're gonna win the day, boys, where the Fraser River flows. Now the boss the law is stretching, bulls and goons he's fetching, and they're a fine collection, as Jesus only knows. But why their mothers reared them, and why the devil spared them, are questions we can't answer where the Fraser River flows. Where the Fraser River flows, each fellow worker knows. They have bullied and oppressed us, but still our union grows. And we're gonna find a way, boys, shorter hours and higher pay, boys. We're gonna win the day, boys, where the Fraser River flows. Well, back before World War I, things were, I guess it would be kind of familiar to people today. 60% of the wealth was possessed by 2% of the population, and half of the people in the United States were living at near starvation levels. In modern times, you'll hear socialism bandied about and talked about during election time, that it's a very bad thing and it would be very terrible if a socialist candidate were elected. But I remind you, in the 1912 election, 108 years ago, Eugene V. Debs got over 1 million votes back in the days when there were less than 100 million people in the United States. And in that same election, 18 mayors in major United States cities were elected running on the Socialist Party ticket. In 1914, by then, Joe Hill found that he couldn't get any work on the West Coast. Everybody knew he was an IWW organizer, and they didn't want to hire anybody who had anything to do with the unions, especially the organizers. So he bummed his way out to Salt Lake City, Utah in 1914, looking for work. And a couple of months after he got there, a man named John G. Morrison, who was a shopkeeper and a former policeman, staunchly anti-union, as all the police were in Utah 100 years ago, John G. Morrison's shop was robbed, and both he and his son were shot dead. And the same night that robbery happened, Joe Hill coincidentally showed up at a doctor's office with a bullet wound in his chest. He told the doctor that he'd been in a fight over a woman with another man and had come to pistols. Well, the doctor sewed up his wound, but after he left, he saw in the newspaper that they were offering a $500 reward for the person who had murdered John G. Morrison. And so the doctor wanted that reward, and he picked up the phone, and he called the police in Salt Lake City, and he turned Joe Hill in. Joe Hill was arrested for both murders, and although there was no circumstantial evidence tying him to those murders, when they went through his wallet and they found that red IWW card, his chances for a fair trial kind of disappeared. They wanted to arrest an IWW organizer, and they were really hoping that they might be able to find him guilty of murder and execute him and send a message to the unions. Well, Joe Hill was in prison there, and it's possible, as we read the books today, 100 years later, we find out he probably could have done a whole lot more to get himself exonerated in that trial. He may have been naive about the American criminal justice system. He may have simply been young and cocky. Or maybe in those 22 months that he was waiting in the prison cell, and over 40,000 petitions and letters were sent to the governor asking for Joe Hill's release from labor leaders all over the world. Maybe those 40,000 letters and petitions convinced Joe Hill that he'd be more valuable to the union movement as a martyr. A few days before Joe Hill died, he wrote a letter to Big Bill Haywood, one of the IWW leaders and a member of the executive committee of the American Socialist Party. He said, "Dear Bill, I die a true blue rebel. Don't mourn, organize. See if you can get my body hauled to the state line. I'd hate like hell to be found dead in Utah. The night before Joe Hill was executed, on November 18th of 1915, a reporter visited him in his cell, and when the guards weren't looking, Joe Hill palmed a small piece of paper and passed it to the reporter. When the reporter got back to his office, he unfolded it and he read it, and he found that he had Joe Hill's will, and this is what the piece of paper said. My will is easy to decide, for there is little to divide. My kin don't need to grieve or mourn. Moss does not grow on a rolling stone. My body, if I could choose, I would to ashes it reduce, and let some summer breezes blow it to where some flowers grow. Perhaps a drooping flower then would come to life and bloom again. This is my last and final will. Good luck to all of you. Joe Hill. The next day, Joe Hill was blindfolded and tied to a red chair at Sugar House Prison. The guards picked up their rifles, and the one in charge began giving the commands for an execution by firing squad. He said, "Ready?" He said, "Set." And Joe Hill screamed, "Fire! Go on, fire!" After Joe Hill's death, his body was cremated, and the ashes were placed in 600 different envelopes and sent to different labor leaders and organizers all over the planet. And I've been in jams with people who've shaken their mandolin and you could hear something rattling inside, and they said, "Those are some of Joe Hill's cremains." Well, after Joe Hill died in 1915, 15 years later, Alfred Hayes wrote a poem about the man who never died called I Dreamed I Saw Joe Hill Last Night, and 6 years later, Earl Robinson set it to a tune. I dreamed I saw Joe Hill last night, alive as you and me. Said I, "But Joe, you're 10 years dead." "I never died," said he. "I never died," said he. "In Salt Lake, Joe, by God, says I, him standing by my bed. They framed you on a murder charge," says Joe, "but I ain't dead." Says Joe, "But I ain't dead." "The copper bosses killed you, Joe. They shot you, Joe," says I. "Takes more than guns to kill a man," says Joe. "I didn't die," says Joe, "I didn't die." And standing there as big as life and smiling with his eyes, says Joe, "What they forgot to kill went on to organize, went on to organize. Joe Hill ain't dead," he said to me. "Joe Hill ain't never died. Where working people organize, Joe Hill is by their side. Joe Hill is by their side. From San Diego up to Maine, in every mine and mill, where working people organize, it's there you'll find Joe Hill. It's there you'll find Joe Hill. Oh yes, I dreamed I saw Joe Hill last night, alive as you and me. Said I, "But Joe, you're 10 years dead." "I never died," said he. "I never died," said he. I guess it was about a dozen years ago. I went to Lawrence, Massachusetts to play some school assemblies for the local junior high schools. And when I finished the gig, I knew that this was the location of the famous Bread and Roses strike. So I went to visit the old mill there by the river. The giant brick smokestack is still there, and all the mill is empty and abandoned. They had a lot of signs up advertising real estate space for rent for architects and lawyers who wanted to have cool office space in the old mill. Across the street was a great big clock about 3 feet wide on the face, and that stood in front of the old boarding house where the old mill workers used to spend the night, and that clock would wake them up and they'd go across the street to work in that mill. Well, in my time, that old boarding house is a museum, and it's a wonderful museum. If you're ever in Lawrence, Massachusetts, be sure to visit it. The most memorable exhibit I saw there was a wooden shuttle about this long with thread wrapped around it, and it traveled back and forth in the old loom at about 50 miles an hour. And of course, if you made physical contact with that shuttle going 50 miles an hour, it would kill you. And so the title card on that glass case that displayed that wooden shuttle said, "Kiss of Death Shuttle." I'll never forget that. This was the old mill in Lawrence where Camilla Teoli, a teenage girl, worked before the First World War. And she had beautiful hair, which she kept piled up on her head with clips. And one day it got caught in the machine, and it actually tore the scalp off her head. And it was sewed back. She went to Washington, D.C. with other workers to testify before Congress about the safety issues in the mills. And some of our safety laws came out of those meetings with Congress. And I found a street in Lawrence, Massachusetts, named for Camilla Teoli. This was the site of the Lawrence strike, the Bread and Roses strike. And there's a famous song called Bread and Roses that's supposed to come out of that strike. But it was actually written by James Oppenheim in Chicago in 1911, the year before the strike. It was published in the American Magazine in the December 1911 issue. The story is that Oppenheim looked out the window and saw a bunch of women. They were mostly teenage girls, immigrant women, on strike at one of the mills there in Chicago. And one of the girls was holding a sign that said, "Bread, yes, but roses too." Think about it. It's pure poetry. Bread, yes, but roses too. It isn't enough to make a living wage. You have to have a little extra for something sweet and wonderful and unnecessary, like roses. So we have a song that came from Oppenheim's poem, and there are many tunes, but the one that I favor the most is the one I learned from the late Utah Phillips, the man who used to do these programs about labor songs on Labor Day when I was a young man. As we come marching, marching in the glory of the day, 1,000,000 darkened kitchens, 1,000 mill-lofts gray, are touched by all the radiance a sudden sun discloses. And the people hear us singing bread and roses, bread and roses. As we come marching, marching, we battle too for men, for they are women's children, and we mother them again. Our lives shall not be sweated from birth until life closes. Hearts can starve as well as bodies. Give us bread, but give us roses. As we come marching, marching, unnumbered women dead go crying through our singing with their ancient call for bread. Small art and love and beauty, their drudging spirits new. Yes, it's bread that we fight for, but we fight for roses too. As we come marching, marching, we bring a greater days. The rising of the women is the rising of the race. No more the drudge and idler tend the toil where one reposes, but a sharing of life's glories, bread and roses, bread and roses, bread and roses. Here's one that was found in the Little Red Songbook. We don't know who wrote it, but they did recycle the wonderful Catholic Church melody, Doxology. Praise boss when morning work bells chime. Praise him for bits of overtime. Praise him whose lures we love to fight. Praise him, fat leech and parasite. Amen. Aunt Molly Jackson was born in Clay County, Kentucky, around 1880. She came from a Union family, and she was jailed at the age of 10 for Union organizing. As a midwife, she delivered some 900 babies there in Kentucky. In 1917, her husband was killed in a mining accident. She remarried a man named Bill Jackson, And her father and her brother were also killed in mining accidents. So her activists as a organizer of miners was heartfelt. In those days, if you were union bound, if you were pro-union, they called you Bolshevik and a Red and a Russian Red. Aunt Molly Jackson was an organizer in Harlan County, Kentucky, organizing the hard rock and coal miners into a union. In 1930, the miners went on strike, and they were locked out, and they were broke. And Aunt Molly Jackson told the story at the Library of Congress. She said, "I remember it was the 17th morning of October, 1930 during the strike. And my sister's little girl, Flossie Doolin, was going over to the soup kitchen that we'd built out of slabs over in the meadow, where we had emptied everything we had from our mining shacks, all the canned stuff that we'd canned up. And we put it all together and collected vegetables from the farmers to make soup, as long as the farmers had anything to give. And every crumb we had went into the soup to try to save the lives of the children. When the miners was blacklisted, 1,100 of them for joining the United Mine Workers of America, and John L. Lewis had promised he would see to us if the miners was blacklisted, because the mine owners had made a secret pact that they'd never work another union man. And John L. Lewis sold us out in 1925, and the union was broke. So these children was going over to the soup kitchen. It was a cold and rainy morning, and the little children was all barefooted, and the blood was running out of the tops of their feet, dripping down between their little toes, running onto the ground. You could trace 'em to the soup kitchen by the blood. They was all barefoot and wearing thin cotton shirts all raggedy and tore. So they waked me, and I went to the door, and I asked my sister's little girl, Flossie, I said, "Flossie, what are you doing with all these little children? And they're here in the cold and rain, and they're all naked and barefooted." And she said, "Aunt Molly, some of these children ain't had a bite to eat since the day before yesterday, and I'm going over to the soup kitchen to see if I can get 'em a warm bowl of soup." And my own son, Henry Jackson, he said, "Oh, they won't have anything but gravy and cornbread." And he said, "Oh, can't you fix me something to eat, Mama? I'm so hungry." And I said, "Henry, you know there's not a teaspoon of salt left." I said, "According to my leadership, we put everything, every last teaspoon of salt and soda even. It's all there. You go and fare with the others. If they have anything in that soup kitchen, it's for everybody," I said. Well, after they passed by, I just sat down at the table and began to wonder what to do next. And then I began to sing out my blues to express my feelings. This song comes from the heart and not from the point of a pen. With the pains in my heart from the condition, as I so often do, I composed a song of the condition, which is the only kind of song that is a folk song. It's what the folks composes of their real lives, out of their sorrow and their happiness and all. And this is the song she made. I'm a union woman, as brave as I can be. I do not like the bosses, and the bosses don't like me. Join the NMU, boys, join the NMU. Join the NMU, boys, join the NMU. I was born in old Kentucky, Kentucky born and bred. When I joined the NMU, they called me a Russian Red. Join the NMU, boys, join the NMU. Join the NMU, boys, join the NMU. My husband asked the boss for a job, and these are the words he said: "I can't work you, Bill Jackson, 'cause your wife's a Russian Red." Join the NMU, boys, join the NMU. Join the NMU, boys, join the NMU. These are the worst times that I have ever saw. You get shot down by gun thugs, you get run out by the law. Join the NMU, boys, join the NMU. Join the NMU, boys, join the NMU. The bosses ride fine horses, and we walk in the mud. Their banner is a $, and ours is stained with blood. Join the NMU, boys, join the NMU. Join the NMU, boys, join the NMU. If you want to join a union as strong as it can be, join the good old NMU and march along with me. Join the NMU, boys, join the NMU. Join the NMU right now, join the NMU. Here's a Woody Guthrie song written in the early 1940s, the 1913 Massacre. It's about a true incident that took place in Red Jacket, Michigan, which is now called Calumet, and that was the heart of the copper mining country 100 years ago. And the miners and the copper mine owners were at war. Ella Reeve Bloor, Mother Bloor, the great union organizer, wrote a memoir published in 1940 called We Are Many. In one of the chapters in that book, she discusses the Italian Hall disaster that happened in Red Jacket, Michigan on December 24th of 1913. It's the largest mining-related disaster in Michigan history. Now, of course, most of the big disasters in the mines in Michigan happened underground and happened to men who were miners. But this one happened above ground on Christmas night, and the victims were mostly women and children. No one was ever tried for this crime. And Woody read that book by Mother Bloor and inspired him to write this song, recycling an old English melody that's called The Nightingale, and sometimes it's called One Morning in May. Take a trip with me in 1913 to Calumet, Michigan, in the copper country. I'll take you to a place called Italian Hall, where the miners are having their big Christmas ball. I'll take you in a door and up a high stair. Singing and dancing is heard everywhere. Before you know it, you're friends with us all, and you're dancing around and around in the hall. There's talking and laughing and songs in the air, and the spirit of Christmas is heard everywhere. Before you know it, you're friends with us all, and you're dancing around and around in the hall. You ask about work and you ask about pay. They'll tell you they make less than $1 a day, working their copper claims, risking their lives. So it's fun to spend Christmas with children and wives. A little girl sits down by the Christmas tree lights to play the piano, so you gotta keep quiet. Amid all this fun, you would not realize that the copper boss thug men were milling outside. Oh, the copper boss thugs stuck their head in the door. And one of them yelled and he screamed, "There's a fire." A lady, she hollered, "There's no such a thing. Keep on with your party, there's no such a thing." Well, a few people rushed, and it's only a few. It's only the cops and the scabs fooling you. Well, a man grabbed his daughter and he carried her down, but the thugs blocked the door and he could not get out. Then others followed, about 100 or more. most everybody remained on the floor. The gun thugs, they laughed at their murderous joke, and the children were trampled in the stairs by the smoke. Such terrible sight I never did see. We carried our children back up to their tree. The gun thugs, they laughed at their murderous spree, and the children that died there was 73. The piano played a slow funeral tune, and the town was lit up by a cold Christmas moon. And the men, they cried, and the women, they moaned. Oh, see what your greed for money has done. In 1848, Robert Schumann, the great European classical composer, wrote a melody for his three daughters, who were all aspiring violinists. If anyone in your family has ever practiced a musical instrument, they probably played the tune that Mr. Schumann wrote for his three daughters, the one that's called The Merry Peasant, and in some places it's called The Happy Farmer. In 1907, somebody put words to that melody, and it became a very popular song in the United States, which is politically incorrect today. It was called Red Wing. It was about an Indian woman and her lover, who was one of the Indian braves. It went like this. There once was an Indian maid, a shy little prairie maid, who sang night and day a love song gay as on the plain she galloped far away. She loved a warrior bold, this shy little maid of old, but so brave and gay he rode one day to battle far away. Oh, the moon shines tonight on pretty Red Wing, the breeze is sighing, the night bird's crying. Oh, far 'neath the stars her brave is sleeping, while Red Wing's weeping her heart away. Well, in June of 1940, Woody Guthrie and his playing and traveling companion Pete Seeger had a gig in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, playing for the Communist Party at their offices there in Oklahoma City. And Woody was getting ready for the show, and he said to himself, hey, what if it wasn't an Indian maid? What if it was a Union maid? And he turned Red Wing into a Union song, one of the great ones, and it went like this. There once was a Union maid who never was afraid of the goons and the ginks and the company finks and the deputy sheriffs who made the raids. She went to the Union Hall when a meeting it was called, and when those company boys came round, she always stood her ground. Oh, you can't scare me, I'm sticking to the Union. I'm sticking to the Union. I'm sticking to the Union. Oh, you can't scare me, I'm sticking to the Union. I'm sticking to the Union till the day I die. This Union maid was wise to the tricks of the company spies. She couldn't be fooled by company stool. She'd always organize the guys. She always got her way when she struck for higher pay. She'd show her card to the National Guard, and this is what she'd say. Oh, you can't scare me, I'm sticking to the Union. I'm sticking to the Union. I'm sticking to the Union. Oh, you can't scare me, I'm sticking to the Union. I'm sticking to the Union till the day I die. This next one has recently been heard being used on television in a Volvo commercial, and it was recorded by the Library of Congress. Pete Seeger used to sing it, and and I learned it from the late, great Art Theme of Peru, Illinois. Hard times in the mill. Every morning, just at 4, you hear the cook's feet on the floor, and it's a hard times in the mill, my love, hard times in the mill. Every morning, just at 5, you gotta get up, it's dead or alive, and it's a hard times in the mill, my love, hard times in the mill. Every morning just at 6, if you're not at your loom, it's a terrible fix, and it's a hard time in the mill, my love, hard times in the mill. The pulley got hot and the belt jumped off, and it knocked Mr. Guyham's derby off, and it's a hard times in the mill, my love, hard times in the mill. Old Pat Goebel, he thinks he's a Hun, puts me in mind of a doodle in the sun, and it's a hard times in the mill, my love, hard times in the mill. Art Theme used to say that was his favorite verse in all of folk music. Ain't it enough to break your heart? You gotta work all day and at night it's dark. Hard times in the mill, my love, hard times in the mill. Yes, it's hard times in the mill, my love, hard times in the mill. Well, this concert of folk songs of the American labor movement is part of the Martin County Library System's 2021 Chautauqua South season. Chautauqua South is sponsored by the Friends of the Martin County Library. My name is Adam Miller. My website is folksinging.org, folksinging.org. And I'd like to close with one more Union song. This one was first recorded in 1930, but it's older than that. This is the Cotton Mill Girls, and it was a song that was sung by the women who worked in those mills in the South. And what I love most about this song is it gives you so many details and so much information about what it was like for those mostly immigrant girls and women who worked in those cotton mills 125 years ago. I worked in a cotton mill all my life. Now I ain't got nothing but a Barlow knife. It's hard times in this old mill. It's a hard time in here. And it's a hard time, cotton mill girls. Hard time, cotton mill girls. Hard time in this old mill. It's a hard time in here. In 1915 I heard it said, go to cotton country and get ahead. It's a hard time in this old mill, it's a hard time in here. It's a hard time, cotton mill girls, it's a hard time, cotton mill girls. Hard time in this old mill, it's a hard time in here. We kids work 12 long hours a day for 15 cents a measly pay, and it's a hard time in this old mill, it's a hard time in here. It's a hard time, cotton mill girls, hard time, cotton mill girls. Hard time in this old mill, it's a hard time in here. When I die, don't bury me at all, just hang my body on the spinning room wall. Hard time in this old mill, it's a hard time in here. It's a hard time, cotton mill girls, hard time, cotton mill girls. Hard time in this old mill, it's a hard time in here. Well, country folks, they ought to be killed for leaving the farm and working in the mill. It's a hard time in this old mill, it's a hard time in here. It's a hard time, cotton mill girls, hard time, cotton mill girls. Hard time in this old mill, it's a hard time in here. They raised our wages up half a cent, but the darned old fools didn't know what it meant. Hard times in this old mill, it's a hard time in here. It's a hard time, cotton mill girls, hard time, cotton mill girls. Hard time in this old mill, it's a hard time in here. They raised our wages up half a cent more, but it went up a dime at the company's store. Hard time in this old mill, it's a hard time in here. It's a hard time, cotton mill girls, hard time, cotton mill girls. Hard time in this old mill, it's a hard time in here. Now the card room kids and the spinning room babies can't keep up with the weave shop ladies. Hard time in this old mill, it's a hard time in here. It's a hard time, cotton mill girls, it's a hard time, cotton mill girls. Hard time in this old mill, it's a hard time in here. I came downstairs to get a drink of water, and the boss he said, I'm gonna dock you a quarter. Hard time in this old mill, it's a hard time in here. It's a hard time, cotton mill girls, hard time, cotton mill girls. Hard time in this old mill, it's a hard time in here. You can knock me a quarter, you can dock me a dime, but I'll go to the office and cash my time. Hard time in this old mill, it's a hard time in here. And it's a hard time, cotton mill girls, hard time, cotton mill girls. Hard time in this old mill, it's a hard time in here. Now if I marry, I'll marry me a weaver. He won't work and I won't neither. Hard time in this old mill, it's a hard time in here. It's a hard time, cotton mill girls, hard time, cotton mill girls. Hard time in this old mill, it's a hard time in here. Well, see that train going round the curve, you know it's all filled up with cotton mill girls. Hard time in this old mill, it's a hard time in here. And it's a hard time, cotton mill girls, it's a hard time, cotton mill girls. Hard time in this old mill, it's a hard time in here. Well, see that train going round the track, I pray to God that it never comes back. Hard time in this old mill, it's a hard time in here. And it's a hard time, cotton mill girls, it's a hard time, cotton mill girls. Hard time in this old mill, it's a hard time in here. Yes, it's a hard time, cotton mill girls, hard time, cotton mill girls. It's a hard time in this old mill, it's a hard time in here.